Good evening and welcome. Welcome to the third of our New College lectures in 2025. On behalf of the entire New College community, I'd like to again warmly welcome everyone who's here with us in this room this evening, especially if this is your first night with us, and also to the substantial number of people that are watching us online. A warm welcome to you. We've been on a big journey this week. The edited versions of the previous lectures are already online on YouTube, courtesy of the excellent Mr. Chris Bailey up the back there in the green shirt. Please just go to YouTube and search for New College Lectures 2025, and the first two lectures are already available, as I say. Let me again begin by respectfully acknowledging the Bidjigal as traditional custodians of these lands, and by paying my respects to elders past and present. I recognise the ongoing presence and contributions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and commit myself to listening, learning and walking with them. On Tuesday night, I acknowledged our distinguished guests at our lectures in detail. Tonight again, I'd like to acknowledge my fellow trustees, the Right Reverend Dr. Michael Stead and Emeritus Professor David Cohen. I'd like to thank the New College team that worked very hard behind the scenes to actually make the lectures happen, and special thanks to Dr. Danny Scarrett and the Reverend Dr. AJ Culp for their special work on the lectures this year. And also unseen is the New College Board, who support our work here, support my role particularly, and I'd like to express my appreciation for them. Now, if you're new to New College, or perhaps visiting us for the first time via live stream, the building in which we're meeting here is the home of approximately 250 undergraduate students. This building has a long-standing and remarkable record of outstanding academic achievement here at the University of New South Wales. We also have at another college, our postgraduate village across Anzac Parade, and it also is a remarkable community with a substantial proportion of doctoral students and postdocs living in community together and undertaking original world-leading research. And we have approximately 7,000 alumni. As well as being affiliated with UNSW, we're affiliated with we're part of the Anglican Diocese of Sydney, and we hold these lectures as a service to Australian society. We have a small research group called the Centre for Christian Apologetics, Scholarship and Education. Danny, AJ and I are co-editors of a quarterly publication, which unsurprisingly is called Case Quarterly, available for inspection up the back. There are also a number of other excellent books available. Sadly, we are sold out of Some New World, which is Professor Peter Harrison's latest work and reference material for what we're speaking about this week. Graham Turner was on Mind Matters, I think, on ABC about a month ago, talking about broken university. So there's a copy of his perhaps more modest book. So there are copies of that available up the back. And Peter also recommended Mind of the Nation. I've not read this one by Michael Wesley. There are copies of that up the back as well. Questions are important at the New College lectures, so please take this opportunity to take out your phone, scan that QR code or type in that URL. And as I've said on previous occasions, as we work our way through the lecture, questions will occur to you. You can use that as an opportunity to actually write your questions as we go along, and that will actually make us ready for the question time. If you prefer traditional methods, please just put your hand up. Someone will bring you a piece of paper and a pencil, and you can write your question on that, and I'll collect for you and share it during question time. As I've said last night and the night before, if you've got a question, there's probably 10 others out there who wish they could have asked it as well. All right, fire alarms, go out the glass doors to my left, your right. And for bathrooms, go out the door out the back there and go down this corridor on my right, your left. You might take this opportunity to take out if you're not scanning your QR code, you might take it out and turn it to silent as well. and let's get underway. Just very briefly, on our first night we heard of the ambition of early leading thinkers, and this influenced the formation of universities in the formation of people in goodness. Doing good proceeds from being good. We then heard of some of the ongoing tensions between different types of learning. Proponents of more contemplative types of learning versus those wanting purposeful learning, vocational or motivated by love. And last night we heard of the rise of science and Peter's observation that it's significant that modern science was nurtured by committed Western Christians who held varying views about the purposefulness of a good creator in ordering the world. But once this pattern of natural laws had been established, science discarded or even purposely ejected the creator as a consideration in scientific practice. This purely naturalistic output which developed has implications for how we do university today, as I imagine Professor Harrison will explain in tonight's lecture, Secularisation and the Future of the University. Professor Peter Harrison is a research fellow at the University of Notre Dame and Emeritus Professor of History and Philosophy at the University of Queensland. From 2014 to 2019 he was an Australian Laureate Fellow, and prior to this the Indrios Professor of Science and Religion and Director of the Ian Ramsay Centre at the University of Oxford. He's written many books, including, of course, Some New World. He is an international authority on history, philosophy and the humanities, and we're greatly privileged to have him again deliver his final lecture here tonight. Before he does so, please join me in prayer, if you feel comfortable. Dear Heavenly Father, as we meet again here this evening, we thank you for the freedom that we have in this country to discuss matters of belief and faith without fear. We ask for your blessing now upon our lecturer this evening, that you would grant him clarity of thought and expression. Please grant to us all knowledge of you and a better understanding of you and your ways in this world. In the name of Jesus and to your honour we pray. Amen. Please join me in welcoming Professor Peter Harrison.
Well, thanks, Bill, again for that welcome. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to Danny and AJ, who have been behind the scenes, and Chris and Nick for their work and patience on the technical side of things. And of course, thanks to you for coming and those who are watching online. I want to briefly summarise what I spoke about last night, and then I'll come on to what I must confess is a much more speculative set of remarks this evening. I said to Bill over dinner that I have perhaps more questions than I have answers this evening, but anyway, I will lay it out before you, and we'll see how we go. But last night I spoke about the emergence of naturalism understood as the exclusion of God and notions of the supernatural from how we understand the world, and indeed from our systems of knowledge. And what I argue there is that naturalism is quite a distinctive Western development, and that it rests on unacknowledged theological premises. Now, those premises have been disguised, or were disguised in the 19th century, by the construction of a history of science that tended to obliterate, or explicitly obliterated, the role of theological influences. Naturalism, as it's presently practiced, then, I think, delegitimises both the contribution of religious traditions and, understood more broadly, that would include traditional knowledge systems or indigenous knowledge. And so naturalism has the effect of, in a sense, excising from our attention, and indeed from serious academic discussion, not merely much of our own history, the bulk of it in fact, but indeed the kinds of contributions that we get from indigenous traditions and other cultures. And I guess tonight I want to talk about that as a problem and to think about some of the ways in which we might address it. And I'll do that in the second half of the lecture, in the first half of the lecture, I want to say much more about how secularisation affects not the content of what we do in the university, but the way in which our universities are structured and organised. And I think the process of secularisation, which has been my overarching theme, has a significant bearing on both. Now, it might not be immediately obvious how secularisation, understood as, say, a decline in the influence of religion, impacts on the way in which our universities are organised. But if we take inspiration from the sociologist Max Weber, who we've learned in previous lectures, introduced the idea of secularisation as the disenchantment of the world. And as we saw last night, this is associated to some degree with influences of Protestantism. Weber maintained that the disenchantment of the world was intimately linked to the rise of a form of authority that he referred to as rational legal authority. And rational legal authority is a version of scientific reason. It's characterised by an emphasis on rationalisation, calculation, differentiation or specialisation, we would say, and the dominance of utilitarianism. And by utilitarianism, I simply mean a focus on useful outcomes. And Weber contrasted rational legal authority with two other forms of authority, charismatic authority and traditional authority, which in his view were displaced by this rational legal authority. Now, the bureaucratic form of authority, Weber assumed to be characteristic of secular modernity. Charismatic authority, traditional authority, as the name suggests, vested authority in monarchs, patriarchs and so on, and relied on long-standing cultural mores, tradition. Charismatic authority was for Weber an inherently unstable form of authority associated with the personal qualities of exceptional individuals. Now, it's not insignificant that Weber derives this term charisma from the New Testament term for the gifts of the Spirit. And there's a sense in which the church was part of the model, or the history of the church was part of Weber's model for understanding what he called the routinisation of charisma, its transformation into bureaucratic forms and structures. And so we can see, for example, in the early church, we have systems of authority moving from Jesus and the apostles to councils, to popes, bishops, priests, and that becomes institutionalised in various forms. Now this, I want to be clear, this is not the emergence of a rational legal authority, but the general point is that organisations often begin at a personal level with small groups, and as they get larger, it becomes necessary for alternative forms of authority to take their place. And Weber described in the early church how the charismatic authority vested in the person of Christ and then the apostles subsequently was routinized into a notion of apostolic succession, where it was the office that held the charisma and not the person. Now, looking much further down the track, rational legal authority, as it emerges in the period of secularisation, is a much more formalised, structured version of this process of what Weber called the routinisation of charisma. Now, it's also relevant that Weber introduced his notion of disenchantment in a celebrated lecture that's commonly translated, and this is not the ideal translation, but it's commonly translated as Science as a Vocation, delivered to students at the University of Munich in 1917. Now, if Weber's undergraduate audience were expecting a rousing, inspirational speech about how great the future was going to be, they were destined to be disappointed. Weber seemed deeply ambivalent about the future of the academic vocation. On the one hand, though, the promise of a rational legal system, regime, was that there would be a genuine meritocracy and a university system guided by scientific rationality. The relative predictability of this system then would facilitate the individual's movement through it, because they would know with a reasonable degree of certainty what the outcome of their behaviours would be. So the impersonal, disinterested nature of this form of authority suggested that it was going to be impartial, and Weber thought that this was a good thing. He certainly thought it would be an improvement over the standard view of what's supposed to go on in German universities, which was developed by the model of Wilhelm von Humboldt. And you can see there, for Humboldt, the idea of the university was essentially moral formation. Okay? So, good craftsmen meant not just craftsmen who produced good work, but who were good in themselves. And interestingly, certainly in the current context, he suggests that that this is important is that people might move from one occupation to another. Who'd have thought? Anyway, Weber didn't think this was the optimal university system, and said that really this system relied on a shared conception of value that was still only cherished by, as he put it, a few overgrown children in their endowed chairs. Okay, I don't know what he could be talking about there, but anyway. Now, by the same token, Weber was realistic about the downsides of this new forensic scientific rationality. In his earlier Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, he prophetically foresaw how a disenchanted world, governed by an arid and soulless bureaucracy, could become what he called an iron cage for its alienated modern captives, whose exercise of autonomy would in practice be quite significantly restrained. And here he is on the iron cage, talking about the technical and economic conditions of machine production, and they determine the lives of everyone who's born into this mechanism. That's all of us. Interestingly, he says no one knows whether this will continue into the future. And he talks about entirely new profits might arise. And here, what he's foreseeing is the possibility of a breakout of charismatic authority to breach the rational legal bureaucracy. Whether he conceived that as a good thing or bad thing, I'm not sure. We've seen charismatic authority go either way. But at any rate, the regime under which he saw people operating was this regime of specialists without spirit and sensualists without heart. And he said people think this is the pinnacle of civilization. And he clearly thought they were mistaken. Now, these Weberian insights that were articulated more than a century ago have been subject to criticism and refinement, but I think this classification of different modes of authority is not a bad starting point to think about some of the internal tensions that characterise our universities today. Now, at first blush, it might seem as if what we're talking about here is a conflict between charismatic and rational legal authority. We can think of the charismatic authority, teacher, scholar, the rational legal authority, admin. And the one-size-fits-all nature of administrative edicts aimed at the imposition of uniformity and consistency tends to flatten and efface what's unique to individual teachers and scholars and the specific personal qualities that ground charismatic authority. But I use starting point advisedly because I think Weber's notion of charisma as an ideal type is not a perfect fit for the personal authority of academics. I do think nonetheless that there is some mileage in the idea of a conflict between the personal and the impersonal, personal being a characteristic of charismatic and impersonal a component of the legal rational system. So this same distinction, I think, might give us some analytic purchase on related discussions about the efficacy of face-to-face lectures and other forms of personal teaching as compared to, say, online methods or the use of AI in teaching and assessment. The genuine prospect that AI might take over significant aspects of teaching and assessing functions is directly in line with the impersonal, efficiency-oriented nature of rational legal authority, which Weber sees as a consequence of secularisation. Now, related to this is the manner in which the very evidence base for discussions of the merits of such proposals is already weighted in favour of rational legal authority. The need to measure and assess outcomes in universities in a scientific fashion is intrinsic to the rational legal approach. So if we take, for example, teaching, to concede that teaching must be assessed at all, especially with metrics, is already to be operating according to the rules of rational legal authority. Now, this is compounded by the fact that despite the aspiration to apply rational measures in the university situation, routinely the wrong things are measured. And there's no greater example of this, I think, than the persistent use of student evaluations to assess teaching quality, despite the fact that study after study after study has shown that student ratings are, if I can get the slide up, student ratings are not correlated with learning outcomes. They're positively related to student expectations of higher grades and hence implicated in grade inflation. They show systematic bias against women and people of colour. Yet universities still use them. Why? Because it's easy to count that stuff and it was harder to do the real measures. So what follows is, you might say, it's not a problem of measurement per se, but what is measured. But I think the imperative to measure slides into measurability. Okay, that's the problem. Now this brings me to a second example, which concerns the other core activity of the university, research and scholarship. Many academics are drawn to the profession because they love teaching and they love doing research. Simply put, they're motivated by intrinsic considerations. University bureaucracies, however, working under the rational legal framework, are not given to gauging the intrinsic motivations of teachers and scholars, but rather measuring their inputs and outputs, how much grant income they earn, how many publications they put out. And there are now additional demands, of course, that those publications have some sort of measurable public impact, although I think that's now dropped off the ARC's register, not to be sure. Now, to be sure, there's the possibility of a fortuitous correlation between an individual who is motivated correctly and producing the relevant metrics. But the key thing is that they're not the same thing. And in fact, they're driven by sets of values that are ultimately incommensurable. So the mismatch between motivation and measurement points to what I think deep down is a clash between incommensurable moral frameworks. And this brings me then to what I think we need to get some analytic purchase on, which are different conceptions of ethics. If I can get this to move on. There we go. So, we're going to do Ethical Theory 101. And I apologise if you know all this, because some of you, I'm sure, will. But here we go. The intrinsic motivations of teachers, researchers and scholars, I think, can be understood in terms of virtues or duties. And that takes us in, as I've said, to these three conceptions of ethics. According to virtue ethics, the good of an activity is related to the way in which it leads to the cultivation and expression of particular virtues. And these in turn are typically related to particular understandings of human goals or ends. And we've already seen in previous lectures in the Aristotelian scheme of things, for example, because human beings are naturally oriented towards knowledge and discovery, they're motivated in that and they're helped in that by the acquisition of what Aristotle calls the intellectual virtues. Okay, so it's about, goodness is about a person being good. That's how it's understood. For a duty-oriented or a deontological framework, the good of an activity resides in whether it conforms to rules or duties that one should perform, again, irrespective of the outcome. So this system of ethics talks about behaviours typically as opposed to character, but the behaviours need to conform to some conception of the intrinsic good. These two moral frameworks, both of which explicitly rule out the consideration of the consequences of our actions, contrast with consequentialism, of which utilitarianism is a subset, and for the purposes of this lecture I'll use those two expressions more or less as if they're the same. Acts are warranted in this scheme of things insofar as they lead to good outcomes, however good is defined. And that's a problem, of course. But to express it rather pejoratively, for a utilitarian, an evil person motivated by malice might, in spite of themselves, do good. Think here, Palestinian peace accords, for example. Lying and cheating might also be good if they give rise to some desired outcome. In each case, the relevant criterion is simply whether the act has good consequences, not how it was arrived at, not the motivations of the individual or their character. they are irrelevant to the measurement of the goodness. So the preoccupation of measurement with outcomes that characterises our university bureaucracies assumes explicitly or otherwise the validity of utilitarianism, I think, at least in the context under discussion. The impersonal nature of consequentialism, which is said to be agent neutral, also maps directly onto the characteristic impersonality of the rational legal authority. Now, if this analysis is correct, it suggests that there's an irresolvable tension at the heart of how our universities operate. The intrinsic drivers of most academics, whether consciously or not, are related to an understanding of virtues or duties. But the language in which the justification of their activities must be expressed is utilitarian, and these languages are very difficult to square with each other. Now, there's also another downside to the dominance of utilitarian measures. It's not just that the instruments that count are not doing a good job of measuring what they're supposed to measure. It's also that the possibility of the long-term effect of working under a regime of measurement of this kind is that it might actually change individuals' behaviours in counterproductive ways, with the virtues of curiosity and creativity being displaced by outcome-directed behaviours that simply aim at satisfying the relevant proxies. Here again, to revert to the Aristotelian distinction, not knowledge for its own sake, but knowledge shaped by short-term goals. So habituation to an imposed utilitarianism might well lead to an atrophy of the intellectual virtues or an abandonment of the scholarly duties in favour of strategies more directly aimed at producing desired, measurable outcomes. And so we see the demise of that, which, if you're a consequentialist, may not be a problem. Now, arguably, this is already evident in the attitudes of students, whose increasing use of AI in university assessments suggests that for them the development of the relevant skills and virtues has been displaced by a focus on producing accessible end products by any means. The fault is not entirely theirs, because since the beginning of their education, they have been subject to summative assessment. And the message of that is that it's not the process that counts, but the outcome. Okay, so typically the measurement instruments are at best a proxy for intellectual development, and they're indifferent to the vast disparities as starting points and opportunities that students have. The outcome-based assessment of students thus shares features of the assessment of the research and scholarship of their teachers, and this utilitarian ethos is again at odds with the cultivation of personal qualities and abilities, or a sense of particular kinds of duty. Outcome metrics are also likely to be counterproductive in other ways. Apart from encouraging efforts to game the system, in the research space, for example, the present regimes of measurement, I think, favour conservative, safe research, resulting in a kind of regression to the mean. So it's just, the best humanities projects take years and years and years of time to do. If you're working strategically, you wouldn't do that, right? Because it's counterproductive. You don't get the brownie points in the databases of the things that get you tenure and promotion, okay? And so you have a choice between being committed to your scholarly duty or ticking the boxes. I think that this ethos also has a stultifying effect on the sciences, and to some extent I'm speculating here, but there are the students doing their AI thing. Karl Popper, who, look, in my view, frankly, didn't get much right about how science worked in practice, nonetheless, I think got this right. He thought that science works by means of conjectures and refutation. So you make a conjecture and you see if it's refuted. Significant advances require bold conjectures, he said, not conservative ones that easily resist falsification. Yet I think the present system incentivises cautious and incremental research. Thomas Kuhn, if I can get him to appear. Come on, Thomas. Here he is. Thomas Kuhn, I think, had a better grasp of how science actually operates. He was a trained physicist. He spoke about a distinction between normal and revolutionary science, using the scientific revolution as his original model. And I think, using those characteristics, what I would suggest is that normal science is what is encouraged by the present system of measurement, not revolutionary science. And normal science is really handle cranking theory regurgitation rather than stepping outside the box. Now, I say that as an outsider, so that's in part a guess. But we do have people asking the question, disruptive science has declined and no one knows why. I think we might know why, okay? I think we might know why. But certainly, I'm not the only person concerned about whether the speed of scientific change is slowing down, and we would need to ask why that's the case. And as I've said on previous occasions, it's likely to be overdetermined, but these regimes of measurement, if we understand them as the downstream of rational legal bureaucracy, might be part of the story. Now, as I said, all of this seems some distance now from secularisation, but its relevance becomes apparent when we consider that utilitarianism first emerged as a major force in moral theory because it was perceived to offer a secular alternative to virtue ethics and deontological frameworks. They were understood as having a religious or transcendental foundation, or they required an appeal to something like an Aristotelian view of human nature that was regarded as unsustainable. So here we have on the history of utilitarianism, a completely secular, forward-looking question, what use is it? In short, there's an argument, in my view, between the secularisation of moral understandings, the rise of utilitarianism, and the imposition of rational legal bureaucracies in our university systems. Now, I think this helps explain why in discussions of the relative merits of particular disciplines, especially the humanities, appeals made to intrinsic value often fall on deaf ears. If we dig deeper into the logic of these arguments, I think it'll become apparent that they rest on principles that people used to take for granted, but no longer do. Unspoken assumptions about particular intellectual virtues or duties. These grounding principles are sometimes not even held by people espousing the arguments that depend on them, and in advancing them they're often simply rehearsing inherited arguments that once made sense in a different historical context where a particular worldview was held in which they were grounded and made sense, but they're no longer convincing. Okay? And this is why I think when Weber speaks about the overgrown children in their endowed chairs, he's thinking about people who are tapping into a worldview that had values that are no longer sustainable, in Weber's view, in a secular world. Now, one final worry, and this does take us some distance from secularisation, but one final worry I think about the dominance of measurement reporting regimes is an increasing bureaucracy that I think will eventually, potentially, collapse under the weight of its own weight. Joseph Tainter, some decades ago, wrote this fascinating account of the collapse of complex societies. And here he describes it, and you can read it for yourself. I'll give you a minute to read it for yourself. Now, I think anyone who's worked in a modern public university will think, this really sounds familiar. And I call the manifestation of this the phenomenon of PVC proliferation. If you look at a university chart from this year and compare it to a university chart even 10 years ago, there's a lot more little boxes underneath the VCs, I can tell you. So my argument is that, you know, the ballooning of portfolios in university organisational charts is an indication of what's going on here. Part of it is to do with the reporting requirements that governments and places like the ARC place on. So I understand part of what's going on, but nonetheless, the cost that is borne by the people actually carrying out the mission is just increasing and increasing. So One new phenomenon prominent in these burgeoning portfolios is risk management, responsible for the identification of the problems here that we're constantly encountering. And my suspicion is that sometimes these problems are not so much encountered as they are constructed. I won't say invented, but perhaps even exaggerated. But I think that this becomes the equivalent of the corporate body's immune system that's there for a good reason, going into overdrive and attacking the corporate body itself. Well, just hold that thought for now. I haven't done the granular work that's needed to establish this, but here's another hypothesis. It's plausible to me that the growth in the business of risk management is linked to the desacralisation of the world and a decline of a belief in providence or fate, along with the conviction that human beings can be masters of their own destiny. So if we look at this history of risk, Peter Bernstein says the revolutionary idea that defines the boundary between modern times and the past is the mastery of risk. The idea that the future is more than the whim of the gods and that men and women are not passive before nature. And I spoke last night about my bad habit of looking at word frequency shifts, but if you look at there's the Google Ngram for risk management that no one had ever heard of before 1960, but then we have this exponential growth, right? We seemed to do okay before we had this, right? So anyway, that's my little peeve. So risk management then I think epitomises the modern premise that we can master the future by means of scientific rationality. That's why I'm focusing on it. It's a signal of something. And this also, I think, fits a general pattern of change that I've described in the realm of moral theory, with the modern displacement of the virtues by consequentialist approaches. And in this instance, I would say, formal risk management has become a substitute for the cardinal virtue of prudence. Prudence, a term which tellingly is derived from providentia, providere, to see ahead. And so generally part of my argument has been that what we see in modernity is a secularisation of the virtues, and I think that's been a theme sort of from square one. But risk management then turns out to be a secularisation of this virtue, and it's also related to a decline in conceptions of providence and hence to the processes of secularisation. As I said, I think there's more work to be done on that, but that's my hypothesis. Okay, well, what follows from this? Are there any fixes? Let me say at the outset, even to ask this question, which we naturally do, is to place ourselves in the framework where we're all utilitarians now, right? We're all utilitarians. And I want to say, first up, that understanding is sometimes enough. And then what we do in the humanities is we attempt to understand things. And I know that this doesn't seem to have much value these days, but sometimes it's enough. And I think even to understand the impersonal nature of the Weberian iron cage can be to some extent liberating, because we're all in it together, including the people who are policing it throughout the university. So they're just as much subject to it as we are. Okay, but I suppose I should promise you a little bit more, because as I say, we are all to some extent utilitarians. So what can we do? I think some of the fixes are obvious. The question is whether they can be implemented, okay, and how you might do that. But I think we need to rebalance authority, right? That we have far too much, this is obviously coming from an academic, we have far too much top-down authority in our universities. We need less bureaucratic and more charismatic and traditional. I think that it's actually traditional authority that is part of our solution, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the second half of the lecture, what I mean by that. It sounds conservative, but it's not, okay? It does sound very conservative, but it's not. And I think also remember that there are virtues to bureaucratic authority in terms of there is something to be said for impartiality and objectivity and scientific rationality for that matter. And that's why I use the word rebalance, because I think that things have just got out of control. And in practical terms, how you do this, I think one of the ways you do this is related, as I said in the very first lecture, to scale. That if you think about the Weberian account of how authority changes, it changes as organisations become bigger. And the problem with our universities is they're too big. This goes back to the Dawkins reforms of the whenever they were, and the one-size-fits-all, the comprehensive universities all doing the same thing. And without proper differentiation, you know, we have the necessity for these bureaucratic authorities. So what's the trend? Well, if we think about the Adelaide situation, no one's stopping these amalgamations, right? There just seems to be an irresistible momentum towards them. But I do think you can create, within these big institutions, you need to create small communities where it's possible to have that rebalance of authority such that personal authority and traditional authority gets a look in. And that's why I think something like a college system within the context of a large university can actually make those things happen. Let's all be Oxford, right? Unrealistic, but if we think about the merits of the Oxford system, it's a federated system where the power resides at the undergraduate level in the colleges, and it's a federated system. In our universities, the money comes in at the top. It's distributed according to whatever formula the government gives to universities, which they don't have to follow, and then it flows down. If it came into the units where it was actually being spent initially and then went up, I think things would be a lot better. What are the chances of that happening? Probably zero, right? Probably zero. But if we were starting again, perhaps after some cataclysmic historical event, right? And it's not out of the question, but if, you know, think how universities first arose in the Middle Ages, right? So I'm not suggesting I want some cataclysmic event to put us back to ground zero, but in theory, then the question is, what practical steps can you take to emulate some aspects of these small communities where you can re-establish virtues, duties, and so on? Okay, moving on. Give weight to things that have intrinsic value. You know, one of our problems is that in the accounting of things, all that matters is money. And we can just think of two examples here. Music schools are a loss leader. Everyone knows that. The question is, do you want to have a culture where music is a central part? And if you do, you have to have schools of music and you have to fund them, right? And, you know, if you're the Vice-Chancellor and you just want to scrap it for the bottom line, it's because you're not weighing in the intrinsic value of what this does for our culture. An Australian National Dictionary, you've got to have that, right? But it's not going to be a money-generating enterprise. But so we have to find a way of making explicit the things we value and factoring them into the calculus of, you know, our budgets. I just take that to be obvious. And the last point I want to make, I can move this on. Oh, we've gone too far. Come back. You know, we need to rethink metrics, and that's all I'll say. I think you've probably got what I think about metrics. And they're particularly horrendous for the humanities. And this, you know, what the ARC are now attempting to do with, interesting to reduce the reporting load on universities, which I applaud, but the idea that there could be some mechanistic way of assessing humanities research, I'm not buying that. Anyway, I could give you the rest of the lecture on that one, but I'll stop and move on. So here we are, naturalism and traditional worldviews. Now here, as I said, I have as many questions as I have answers, so I'll be interested to get your take on this. Whatever aspirations I think there may be for universities to be morally neutral, and that was the Weberian model, it turns out that moral convictions are quite difficult to keep away. As alluded to in the first lecture, we now encounter what Simon During at Melbourne Uni has aptly called the evangelical humanities, which position themselves as society's conscience. And this phenomenon represents a shift amongst left-leaning academics, and let's be frank, most of us are left-leaning academics, away from a concern with class politics to identity politics. In turn, this has provoked a response from more conservative voices urging that universities return to what they imagine to have been a traditional role in supporting Western values. But on both sides of this argument, people are concerned with values. That's the key thing. Now, I must confess to having sympathy with both sides of this discussion, and I have considerable unease at the tension that there is between them. On the one hand, I think that progressive politics grounded in ideas nurtured within the university context and promoted by acts of protest in the past helped usher in significant and important social reforms. And going back some time, I'm thinking here especially of civil rights in the US, equal rights for women. And these were things that originated in they were ideas that universities had and went out and went into bat for them. Part of my ambivalence, I think, is owing to the backlash that the evangelical humanities has elicited, and which is conspicuous in the tax on higher education we now see in the US. Now, whatever the merits of the new moral causes, the backlash they have elicited, at the risk of sounding utilitarian, would suggest that they're not strategic. And I think they're implicated in the growing distrust of the public in our universities. But I have two more concerns. And one is that there is a subtle and sometimes not so subtle element of moral coercion witnessed in some of the mandatory training modules and compulsory DEI statements. But ultimately, my unease about the polarity between the evangelical humanities and the advocates of Western civilization lies in the manner in which the debate is conducted. And this, I think, comes down to a lack of an agreed framework within which moral differences can be adjudicated or managed. So it's the failure to have an underlying system of resolving moral conflict that is the problem. This gives rise to a situation where the right course of action seems not to engage opponents in civil discussion, but simply to label them as moral inferiors. This, in turn, on my analysis, is owing to the processes of secularisation which dissolve the often tacit framework within which such differences were managed. And I should add to this the perceived failure of subsequent alternatives to a religious or moral consensus, such as liberalism, which I think is under attack by both right and left. And I still think there's life in liberalism, but we can talk about that. Or, the philosopher Habermas has come up with the notion of a common life world that he sees as providing the foundation for these kinds of discussions. Now, one way into this, I think, is to consider one of the current projects of the progressive humanities, which is that of decolonising the curriculum and elevating the status of Indigenous knowledge. And I want to briefly look at this as a kind of test case for highlighting the problems with a supposedly secular neutrality, and I want to suggest a partial solution. There are two aspects to this which I can really only gesture towards in this lecture, but which I hope will give some food for thought. The basic idea is to highlight the things that Western religious worldviews have in common with Indigenous forms of knowledge, and suggest that finding space for the latter requires the abandoning of the idea of a secular naturalistic neutrality, which is the assumed basis for science, and accepting in its place something more pluralistic or something more traditional. Now, in order to get us thinking about how this might be possible, I want to remind you of the post-Enlightenment theories of human progress that argued for science as a kind of endpoint of civilisational advance. So here we have Kant's understanding of knowledge moving from the theological to the scientific, anthropologist Tyler with his similar tripartite notion of human development, and we could add any number that have that same pattern. These stadial understandings of human progress sought to characterise both the prevailing Christian worldview and the beliefs of traditional cultures as relics of an infantile past. Religion, whether in an advanced Western form or a primitive traditional form, had to be discarded. The secularisation of knowledge then leaves no room for either the long tradition of Western civ at its heart, which I think at its core is religious in some sense, and don't fall for the idea that Greek philosophy is in some sense neutral. It's not, it's religious. to say the sentence again, so the secularisation of knowledge then leaves no room for either the long tradition of Western civ, which is, I think, essentially religious, or the traditional worldviews of religious people. And it's not possible to admit one without the other. So a more concrete example then, what do we do with the status of Indigenous knowledge? And as I've said before, I'm not presuming to speak on behalf of Indigenous people. I'm simply pointing to this as an example. So clearly there are predictable objections to the idea that Indigenous knowledge could be counted as science, and the usual suspects, Richard Dawkins, Jerry Krauss. If you're familiar with the science versus religion discussions, these names will be very familiar to you. And you can see here the equivalence is made between, say, creation science and primitive. In fact, the language here is precisely that. It could have been taken from Auguste Comte or Fraser, a 19th century anthropologist. And here's Jerry Coyne, just to give you another one. It's ludicrous to do this. Religious beliefs, superstitions, false assertions, biological creationism, etc. So falsehoods and superstitions. So that for these guys whose usual target has been Western religion, now turn their sights to Indigenous religion. This suggests that if these guys are against it, there's space for a common cause. This gang have recently, you might have caught up with this, I'm just throwing this in gratuitously, but these guys have got together to write a book, The War on Science. Are they talking about Trump attacking science? No, they're not. They're talking about, effete left-wing intellectuals. So the book is complete nonsense, and if you want to read see a devastating review of it, look up this guy Sean on YouTube. Anyway, I should move on, but it's a 4-hour video, but you will be riveted from start to finish. Now, where am I? So what I hope to suggest, you can see from the criticisms of the anti-Christianity, anti-Indigenous knowledge gang, is that they buy into two mistaken ideas about the history of science that we discussed in detail yesterday. The idea that science replaces religion as a natural part of the maturation process of human societies, and the idea that science has been intrinsically naturalistic from the start, in the sense of excluding the supernatural. So I think that Jerry Coyne and the gang, it is correct to say that Indigenous knowledge is not science as we presently understand it. But if our present conceptions of science need to be corrected, then it may be that we can find a way to square that circle. Now, I want to be clear here, my suggestion is not that we should abandon the content of what we're presently doing in science, but I do think we need to adjust the frame in which we view that content. What we think science is, what we think science demands of us, for example, that we adopt a thoroughgoing ontological naturalism. The history I gave yesterday, I think, gives us good reason to think that science does not require naturalism, and that on the contrary, it's premised on a set of religious assumptions about the intelligibility of the world. Neither does history suggest any inevitable conflict between science and a religious understanding of the world, notwithstanding this guy who we looked at yesterday. And if we begin to adopt something like, that frame, a different frame of understanding science, I think we have the possibility of bringing different forms of thinking about how the world works together. More than this, I think to some extent science, and don't get me wrong, I'm not a science skeptic or a science hater, but I do think that science is implicated in the rise of scientific instrumentalism, which is to say that it played a role in the perpetuation of an exploitative utilitarian approach to the natural world. Now, it's interesting here, again, another example of Indigenous knowledge, but think here about the contrasting discourse about the Spinifex project, which is a fantastic collaborative project at UQ between Indigenous people and UniQuest, the clue is in the title. Okay. So here is the Indigenous leader speaking about spin effects. That it's a sacred thing, it belongs to country, and that's what sacred means. And here is the CEO of the company. We're looking to tick boxes from a data perspective. We're looking to support differentiators. It could mean a gel has great market disruption potential. Now, I think these are two quite different languages. And what we don't seem to have is a medium in which these two can be held together. And my suggestion is that it's the capture of some aspects of science by this rational, legal, bureaucratic, utilitarian, secular framework, just to use a few labels, that lie at the heart of that incommensurability. And so when I talk about reframing science, I'm not suggesting that this gel is not going to work in some way, but I'm suggesting that the framework on the left is some distance from the framework on the right, okay, and that there's work to be done to make those cohere, and that work is parallel in certain respects, going right to the problem of the incommensurability between academics' inherent values and duties and the imposition of an instrumental utilitarianism. Okay. So what I'm going to do is, in the last few minutes of the lecture, I'm just going to throw some ideas at you from some philosophers of science who are quite radical, but I think are interesting, and I hope give us some ideas about how we might get over this trick. But again, what I wanted to say is that structurally, this problem is in a sense the same as how we relate religious conviction in the traditional Western sense to scientific instrumentality. It's the same problem, and therefore if we get a solution to that, it's a positive thing for everyone. Okay, so as I said, let's have a look at Paul Feyerabend, who's in his time a bit of a stirrer, but I've come to appreciate his work much more and more. And what he suggests is that there was a fair competition in the history of science between Western philosophy and the new scientific philosophy, and I described that yesterday. But he said there was never a competition between traditional knowledge and the new science. And because there wasn't a fair competition, if we're to explain the conflict now, it wasn't that one side won, but the apostles of science just decided that they were the winners and they suppressed the bearers of alternative cultures. Okay, so that there was a suppression exercise. Feyerabend concludes, and I quote, "There was no objective comparison of methods and achievements of different cultures, and this is because they were simply regarded as primitive equivalents to a version of science that had been superseded." Feyerabend also argues that in a truly free society, there should be a more open exchange of ideas without an implicit censorship of any, and with no group seeking to maintain a monopoly. So the myths, the religions disappeared, not because science was better, but because, as we've said, there was a deliberate suppression. Moving on then to his conception of a free society, all traditions have equal rights. So a tradition receives these rights, he says, not because of the importance, the cash value, right, the utilitarian payoff, but because it gives meaning to the lives of those who participate in it. Right? It gives meaning to the lives of those who participate in it. And the meaning business is something that's gone out of our knowledge systems in the university, even to some extent in the humanities, where it should get a run. Now, Feyerabend's reference to traditions bring to mind other thinkers who speak of tradition. As we've seen, Weber has a conception of traditional authority, and in relation to the discussion of the first half of the lecture, as I've said, restoring some elements of traditional authority might serve as a counter to a runaway legal rational authority. The other figure I have in mind here is Alistair MacIntyre, who is an advocate for a robust form of tradition. And I wish I had the time this evening to spell out to you what MacIntyre's conception of tradition is, because I think it's a wonderful solution to some of the problems that we've been addressing here. And I recommend reading anything of MacIntyre's, but this book is one. Those of you who are familiar with his work will recognise that his treatment of the virtues is actually underpinning much of what I've said over the past 3 nights. So he's a very important thinker. A tradition for McIntyre here is it's a historically extended, socially embodied argument. And it's an argument about precisely what goods constitute that tradition. Now, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but what McIntyre wants to suggest is that our conceptions of rationality are already embedded in traditions. There's no rationality with a capital R out there. They're already embedded in traditions, but traditions provide us with a context in which we can discuss things and resolve them to some extent, and this doesn't end up in a kind of hopeless pluralism and relativism. Okay, so it's a balance between a pluralistic system, which is really what Feyerabend is advocating, and a way of resolving plurality. But really that's all I can gesture towards at the present. Now, coming back to Feyerabend's prescriptions, they may seem rather radical and have little prospect of being implemented in a meaningful way, but what the Indigenous knowledges discussion that we're currently having, what it indicates is the way in which the momentum is shifting, and I think shifting in the right way. It's not yet clear to me, as I've said, how we might commensurate between science on the one hand and religion and other non-naturalistic approaches on the other, and that would include Christianity and Indigenous knowledges. But my own view is that the social progressives within the humanities have not fully understood how the logic of their openness to other cultural traditions should also bring an openness to the religious past of the West. For their part, champions of Western values have similarly failed to understand that they have a common cause with the evangelical humanities, as it were, in an attempt to move past the domination of a secular naturalism. This is why I think there's value in both of those positions. It's just that they need to realise their common ground. Moving towards wrapping up then, I want to add one final voice to the mix, and this is the philosopher of science, Sandra Harding, who in her youth was given to some extreme statements, but I think in her maturity said things that were really, really very interesting. And so here's one. Learning about other cultures' knowledge systems invites Westerners to engage with unfamiliar logics of nature's order and research. Absolutely right. And we can practice giving up, she says, the universal value of some of the great binaries of modern Western thought. And there she labels them. And these are some of the things that I've been talking about, right? So, for example, the natural versus the supernatural, okay? That's not a distinction that operated in our past, and it's not a distinction that functions in other cultures. Between facts and values, which is one of the main thrusts of McIntyre's thought, that the distinction between facts and values emerges at a particular moment in Western history, and if we do away with that, it opens up whole possibilities for how we think about morality or how we rethink morality. So I would simply add to this what I think is missing in both Harding and Feyerabend, and that is to say an appreciation of the fact that learning about our own past in the correct register brings exactly these benefits, if only we can rectify our persistent misreadings of the past. Traditional humanities has been regarded as inimical to arguments for exposing the curriculum to outside voices. And this is because we've tamed our past, rendering it familiar and distorting it in the process. We need to open ourselves to re-encountering the past in its strangeness and unfamiliarity. The past is indeed another world. And I hasten to add that this is not an advocacy of a nostalgic return to some imagined past, but a way of drawing on both our own history and the underutilised insights of ignored and marginalised cultures to move forward in a new direction. Finally, I should say, I should concede that some of the analysis over the past 3 nights might have seemed a bit negative and depressing. At some level it is negative and depressing, I have to admit. But the experience for most of us, I think, in the university sector is really of a dual nature. The truth is that we work with colleagues who, most of them, are models of intelligence and creativity and collegiality and goodwill. And this is true across all levels of the university, incidentally, including those who inhabit the big house. This is why I think the Weberian image of our being imprisoned by forces beyond our control is so compelling. It explains the paradox of the powerlessness of many talented and motivated individuals in the face of inexorable bureaucracy. And that this is a paradox, I think, that applies at every level of the university, even those who we imagine holding the levers of power. But I think being surrounded by talent and goodwill gives me some optimism about the prospects of leaving behind conceptual confusions and perhaps making a jailbreak from the Weberian iron cage. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. I was told people couldn't hear me last night and I needed to speak up. Anyway, I'm here to ask questions, so thank you for letting me share the stage with you, Peter. Okay, we're on to questions now, and we've got lots of questions coming through, and I will read them. We were asked whether we could have them up there, but we're not at that point yet. Okay, if smaller universities and colleges are better because they can specialise, how do we also make sure that some music department survives somewhere? Should universities compete or not? I think there are two questions, but I'll let you deal with it.
Yeah, okay, so no, universities shouldn't compete. That's nuts. Why would we? I mean, we're all in the same game, right? So, you know, what I think the thrust of the first question, the logic is that what we need to make our vet science departments and our music departments and the standard loss leaders, we need to cross-subsidise. And if we're going to cross-subsidise, we need something like a comprehensive university. Yeah, I think that's right, you know. So you know, the alternative is to find a rich, you know, rich benefactor, and then you can have these institutions. So look, I'm not wanting to dismiss the practical problems here, but it's possible that if a society thinks that music is important, then the government, if it represents the desires of the people, then it funds these things. And we used to have conservatoriums of music as freestanding things. Were they lost? You know, why couldn't we have them again? Well, we couldn't have them again because we have this the corporate university model, and we don't have to have it. Look, I should say something that I haven't said throughout, and it gives me the opportunity. I've used the frame of secularisation to frame all of this, and that's one frame. The frame of capitalism is even perhaps more powerful way of explaining what's going on, and I do believe they're linked, and Weber gave us the link. So I should say that in passing as well. But my suggestion is not that secularisation accounts for all the problems, but it does give us one way of thinking about them.
Well, that leads us on to our next question. Is capitalism the inevitable economic system of naturalism and utilitarianism?
Yeah, look, that's a great question, you know, and yeah, I'm thinking here of Frederick Jameson's saying that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And really, I think that part of Weber's conception of the iron cage was to do not merely with bureaucracy but with capitalism. And we're kind of caught. I think that's what he would suggest. And we can attribute so many of the problems in our modern cultures to capitalism, but it's very difficult to think our way out of that and what it would take to back that up. And so just as my suggestions about you have to really tolerate bureaucracy and try and find ways to moderate its excesses. And I think that one way of dealing with capitalism, again, the moderation of its excesses. And if you think of the Nordic countries, for example, you know, that's a good model. And if you think, well, what are the happiest countries? It's interesting to look at an index of the happiest countries in the world. It's Finland and Denmark and Iceland and Sweden, and we're down at number 10. But what it suggests is that capitalism in itself can actually be tamed and it can be moderated, right? But there has to be a will to do that. And I think the same applies with our university systems, right? You can tame it to some degree if you can't kill it, right? And as we've said, it is, I think, easy to imagine. And the end of the world might be the only other prospect for getting rid of capitalism and bureaucracy.
Well, and what 3 questions were packed into one at this point. Is nihilism the inevitable outcome of naturalism?
Look, I think people have different views about this. I think it is. And I think Friedrich Nietzsche is the clearest philosopher on this. He said, once you abandon the Christian framework, you can keep mouthing the morality of that, but it's completely empty. You're kidding yourself, right? And he was very hard on the utilitarians, right? So he said, there's no point in maintaining these particular moral prospects if you're not buying into the framework that makes them intelligible. And I think he's exactly right. So the question then is, it's very interesting because is this being live cast?
Yes.
Okay. An anonymous, I exchanged some of these lectures with an anonymous friend who expressed the view that my suggestion that utilitarianism equals secularity and that deontology and virtue ethics require some kind of transcendental framework. Now, he questioned that latter. I'm convinced that that's the case. I don't think you can make virtue ethics or deontology work without some at least transcendental framework. So you think, for example, Kant, with his, for those of you in the know, his conception of how we derive duty, it was clear that Kant thinks we can derive our duties from reason. No doubt about that. That's a purely secular frame. But for Kant, they don't make any sense without 3 postulates. And one was human freedom, one was immortality, and the third was God, right? So that we can derive our duties from reason, but they're only intelligible given those considerations. And I think that all of the deontological theories that follow from that, whether they acknowledge it or not, have that kind of basis. And, you can get virtue ethics up in an Aristotelian framework, but, that requires a set of transcendental commitments to a view of human nature. So it could be secular. I think the jury's out, but if you follow people like Nietzsche, you'll think that nihilism is an implication of secular rationality.
And the third part of this single question is, are we left with one remaining societal value, freedom of choice?
No, I don't think so, because I think, freedom is always, we're always operating under constraints. And I think that the notion of the atomistic liberal individual is a fiction because we're socially embedded. And this idea of individual autonomy, as I say, I just think it's a fiction because we're social creatures. And again, it would take a longer time that I've got to argue that that's the case. So I'll just put it as my proposition to you. And I think that, again, the McIntyrean idea of a tradition in which we're embedded gives some notion of that. But this idea of the atomistic individual is another modern development that's, I think, part of the overall package of modernity that I described mostly last night.
Next question. Do you think writing up scientific research in more narrative forms, in stories of the creative processes behind scientific knowledge, could that be a way of bringing Western and Indigenous ways of doing science into a more respectful dialogue?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. I'm not. So let me say this: that what tends to get elided from the way in which scientific research is reported is the human processes that went into producing it. The anthropology of science, as it were, the contestation of ideas, and how it's generated as a human process. Now, as a human, as a humanities scholar, I say it's constructed, and I know this drives scientists nuts, but it is constructed. It doesn't mean it's not true. It doesn't mean it's not true, but it's not achieved by tapping into some capital T truth out there in the world. It's achieved by the cumulative collective endeavours of individuals working through, a trial and error and an evolutionary process where some ideas get discarded and some get to the top. That is a human process of construction. And I'm saying it doesn't mean that the science isn't true. On the contrary, we know vaccines work, for example, all of that stuff. But the end product is the product of these human things. And this was the big project of Bruno Latour, who I think was, again, he drove the scientists nuts, but he was right on the money. They're human processes. And I think if the public understood the human dimension of how science operates, including its fallibility, right, it would be a better way of communicating science. Now, I haven't answered the question because I've just said what I think would be a better mode of the public understanding of science. But I do think more broadly to understand these as human processes embedded in cultures, as Weber said, his conception of, we kid ourselves that we think that we're somehow extracted from human life and a historical process, that when we do philosophy is the worst at this, I think. Analytic philosophy, we're on tape, aren't we? Yeah. Okay. Let me stop talking about analytic philosophy. But sometimes we think they're human activities that sort of float above in some pure ethereal Platonic world, right? And I think all of the things we do have a human element. So getting around to answer the question, yeah, I do think that would be important because it shows that science is just another human activity. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean that in a positive sense because it's because in understanding it as a human activity that we see its true value and just how remarkable it is as a process.
Thank you. It seems likely to me that these changes will need to be made on the other side of significant crisis and institutional and cultural collapse. How might we prepare for this in advance?
Yeah, well, look, that's a pretty pessimistic point of view. Although, the net zero stuff's not looking too healthy at the moment. So, we might be headed for an apocalypse. I hope not. I wouldn't wish it on us, but just so that we can get our universities in order. So I guess what I'm saying is, to go back to my first point, I do think understanding what's going on is a value in itself, right? I have to say that because it's consistent with the whole approach. And so what I'm attempting to do is, first of all, to understand what's going on, and I do think that has a value. The question seems to suggest that I need to have, some workable solutions, and I understand that. I'd love to have some workable solutions. I think I can indicate directions in which things might be done, and as agents within these systems, there are things we can do. We can bring about cultural change as individuals in our institution, and that really, I think, is the best hope. That people think, look, we've had enough, and if enough of us get together, we can make some changes around the margins. But like capitalism, I think we're not going to see the end of rational legal authority anytime soon, barring the eschaton.
The next question has the word epistemology in it, so you might want to explain that for some lesser intellects in the room like mine. In linking rationality to tradition, are McIntyre et al. Making a claim about epistemology, or is it something weaker? Would you describe them as postmodern?
Yeah, look, yes, they are making a claim about epistemology, which is to say they're making a claim about our theories of knowledge. Now, here's a chance to give you a word history. Epistemology, from the Greek episteme, which interestingly is often typically translated science in Aristotle, and that's often translated in the scientia into Latin. So epistemology, again, interestingly, epistemology as a term comes into the West late, right? It's a modern term. No one talked about epistemology until I think about the 18th century is I do know the date somewhere, but it's deep in the recesses. I'm explaining epistemology, Bill. Anyway, but epistemology is typically what people think philosophy is about, which is a theory of knowledge. Now, let me get to the question. Yeah, so these guys are really saying, part of what I think is being said by these guys is that rationality, we tend to think following the Enlightenment, there's a conception of rationality as some pure form of reasoning that somehow floats free of the human agents that do it and the cultural context in which they're embedded. And what I'll just stay with McIntyre, what McIntyre's point is, no, our conceptions of rationality are culturally bound. And other cultures have different forms of rationality, and for you to say your rationality is better than theirs is actually possible. It's possible, but you shouldn't necessarily take it for granted. And in the McIntyrean conception of tradition has ways of managing different forms of rationality in a way that doesn't lead to a relativism that says any rationality is as good as any other, but the tradition has ways of sifting versions of rationality and showing how it's a little bit like the process of English common law, how English common law, it's not statute law where the rules are set out, but over time the tradition evolves in ways, and it evolves because some things are better than others, right? It's a kind of evolutionary process. So that's how McIntyre sees tradition as working. But the key thing in relation to this question of epistemology or rationality, and I think this is the mistake of things like analytic philosophy, that assume there's some pure form of resolving all of these things. There isn't, right? Because, coming back to the McIntyrean point, our conceptions of rationality are deeply culturally embedded and informed. And this is part of, I think, the puzzlement that when we encounter other cultures that have a different understanding of how things operate, okay, science is not the only way of adjudicating between those things. That's what I would say, okay? And I'm not saying here, just to be clear, I'm not saying here all versions of rationality are equal. There are ways of adjudicating, right? But the assumption should not be that there's some version of rationality scientifically that we in the West have uniquely contingently evolved and that it trumps everyone else's.
Thank you. The whole point of the engineering discipline is to produce stuff that works and will need to be used. Can engineering exist if we cease using utilitarianism as the main measure of value?
No, absolutely. We need engineers. Don't get me wrong. Engineers, we love you. So you know, and of course we need all kinds of things. But here's what I think. To go back to the science question again, and this does relate to engineering. Often science takes the credit for engineering's achievements. Let me say that, you know. So, and aeronautics, I think, is a classic example of this. But I digress. I think part of the point here is that often in our understandings of science, we conflate utility with truth. And I want to say to you, if something works, it doesn't follow that the theory that got it up there is true. Okay, that's really important to understand. And we know this from the history of science, because the history of science is full of theories that worked and gave us technology but turned out to be wrong in the long historical trajectory of things. So you might be an engineer that build something on the basis of a theory that could be wrong. So my point with regard to utilitarian outcomes is, don't think that they justify the theoretical underpinnings upon which they were built. Because, you know, radios came to us because of a theory of there was an ether. No one believes there's an ether, but we still got radios that work, okay? And I could give you instance after instance of that. So my only thing to say here would be, don't confuse utility and the fact that something works, don't confuse that with the truth of the theory that gave rise to it, because that might not, there's no justification. And we know that because historically we've had, time and time again, false theories giving us technologies that work.
We're talking about aeronautics. We could talk about Joukowsky aerofoils, but let's move on. The topic is God and the university, secular university. Does God have a place in your ideal university, with the Bible seen as the source, or is that too radical? Smiley face.
That's too radical. No, yeah, that is too radical, and it's too radical because we live in a pluralistic society, and at the public university we have to some extent, and this in a sense is part of the whole problem I've been addressing here. But what a genuinely pluralistic university would be, it wouldn't privilege a naturalism that excludes other forms of knowledge. So that would be rather my point. That said, I do think in the context of my arguments for smaller is better, I do think there is room for institutions that have an explicit mission, right? Be they, I won't say Muslim madrasas, that could be controversial, but based on the logic of my smaller is better, I do think that that's the case, and that people have the choice then to attend those places. But for our public universities, I think they need to be genuinely open to a range of views, and that would include views that are non-naturalistic. Okay, now I know I'm not suggesting we have non-naturalistic science necessarily, but it's something we're thinking about, and that goes back to the question of how we frame science, right? What we understand it to mean and what its implications are.
Thank you. If the modern public university model is broken, to what year would you wind the clock back to the best of times?
Well, back when I went to university, that's a long time. No, well, I do think there was something we said to those medieval universities, but the dental care was poor. So it's hard to say. You can tell I do have a lingering fondness for the Oxford system, and that in a sense is still way back in the past, right? So, and my affection for that is because it is bottom up and it is collegial and it still retains elements of that original corporate structure. I will say this: you spend more of your time in meeting. I spent more of my time in meetings than I have in any other university, because if you're genuinely democratic, you actually have to run the place, and it's a lot of work, and it's not efficient. So I've said where rather than when. But in a sense, as I say, those Oxbridge places are really a blast from the past. But look, I do say when I went to university, if you think about in the very first lecture the litany of problems with our present universities that I listed, many of those were not present when I went to university back in the 70s. And I think any university academic who's had a career that spans that period has a sense of what has been lost, right? If I had to go back to the 70s, yeah, okay.
Thank you. What is the relationship between Weber's rational legal authority and scientific authority? They seem to me to be quite different. A crucial experiment changes science, but won't divert bureaucratic rules.
Yeah, okay. So look, that's a good question, because Weber means scientific rationality in a much broader sense than he means the kind of rationality that operates within the practice of science. So it's important to distinguish those, and I think that would be sufficient to answer the question. But I should say it's probably worth saying, well, what if he doesn't mean the kind of logic that operates within the sciences, what does he mean by that? And I think there's a general understanding of what we might call instrumental rationality. And this is a technical understanding of rationality that has the characteristics that I outlined at the beginning. But if you're interested in what that concept encapsulates, you'll find it in Weber. You'll find it in the writers of the so-called Frankfurt School, and you'll find it in Habermas, Jürgen Habermas. And perhaps here's a way of thinking. Habermas, I think, has, in one sense, more precise distinctions than Weber. And Habermas makes the distinction between scientific rationality and communicative rationality, and he sees communicative rationality as more characteristic of the humanities. But there's a kind of there's a kind of utilitarian technological aspect to scientific rationality in the Weberian sense, but he doesn't mean by that this is how rationality operates within the practices of specific sciences in relation to things like, how we do experiments and the kinds of things that, the logic of experiment and the outcomes of experiments and so on. That's not what falls under the description of scientific rationality. It's much broader and more general than that.
Thank you. I think we're moving towards our last question, so if you do have a question out there, be quick. I was just curious, what may we expect to be the long-term consequences of replacing curiosity, the pursuit of truth and knowledge, with metricated-centred pursuit of outcomes?
So, look, it's a good question, and I think it's an empirical question, so that, in a way, we can wait and see. But what's interesting is I think there's a lot of interesting. There is a lot of data about whether science is slowing down in terms of its novelty and originality. And I'm not completely over that literature. I just dipped into it because I thought, well, this is an interesting potential link with, my argument about the dominance of metrics and so on. So, and look, I think it's to do with the peer review system, and I think the replication problem is also part of the crisis of, I do think that there's a bit of a crisis that science is facing, particularly those ones that use the dodgy statistical methods, the social sciences, the medical research. So my prediction is that science will slow down, basically. Right? That would be my prediction. But as I say, it's not just a matter of hypothesising, because I think it's an empirical question that we can just measure and see.
We can have a fun discussion about that. Please join me in thanking Professor Harrison.
Thank you.
I'll let you step down. Thank you.
I'd like to call on the Right Reverend Dr. Michael Stead, Bishop of South Sydney, to move a vote of thanks.
I am immensely grateful for the journey that Professor Harrison has taken us on to, not just tonight, but over this series of 3 lectures. For me, Peter's account of the impact of secularisation, and particularly its impact on the modern university, reminds me of a Looney Tunes cartoon from my childhood. The cartoon involved an escalating contest between Wile E. Coyote and Ralph the sheepdog, each cutting off the branch that the other was sitting on until it culminated in the coyote inadvertently cutting off the ledge that he was standing on. Peter's lectures have shown us the downstream impact of several centuries of secularisation on the modern university, tracing out how the process of secularisation has cut the modern university adrift from its very foundations, leaving it increasingly unable to justify what is done on the basis of appeals to intrinsic value or virtue. Peter has shown us, very helpfully, that the original purpose of the university was moral formation, that the higher forms of knowledge were conceptual, metaphysical, theoretical, and what we now recognise as science didn't flourish at the outset because that kind of knowledge, that kind of practical how-to knowledge, wasn't valued. In the 18th century, however, these foundations were undermined by the fabricated history of scientific naturalism. According to Huxley and others, there is and has always been an inherent conflict between naturalism and supernaturalism, and that the rise of modern science is the triumph of scientific naturalism over unscientific supernaturalism. This has become the accepted narrative of our day, but I'm very, very grateful to Peter for reminding us that this is a false dichotomy and indeed a historical fiction. But perhaps even more significantly, Peter has really helpfully traced out the collateral damage that this fabricated history has had. By pitting naturalism and supernaturalism against each other, it has inverted Aristotle's valuation of the different types of knowledge. It's inverted the knowledge pyramid, if you like, and that in turn has destroyed the shared conceptions of virtue that underpin the university, like the cartoon cutting off the branch on which you're sitting. A university for the purpose of moral formation and in pursuit of theoretical and metaphysical knowledge can only be grounded in either deontological or virtue ethics. Naturalism's denial of the supernatural rules that out of court. Perhaps better than my Looney Tunes cartoon metaphor, the better metaphor is cut flowers in a vase. Because if you think about it, Huxley's arguments, well, even though they're centuries old, I'd say they've had traction for centuries. A bunch of flowers in a vase retains the appearance of life and vitality, but only for a time. Eventually the flowers will wither because they are disconnected from the thing that gives them life and meaning. In a sense, that's what we are now seeing today. And tonight's lectures, very helpfully, have shown us the downstream effect, these changes that have been brewing for centuries playing out in our own day. We see universities grounded in nothing more than a utilitarian ethic, a what works approach. We see universities driven by a rational legal authority. Yeah, okay, it leads to predictable outcomes, but it's impersonal, impartial, bureaucratic. We are trapped in this disenchanted world, a Weberian iron cage. Peter has traced out some of the implications for this tonight, a decline in revolutionary science, the dominance of metrics, and as he said, it's a system collapsing under its own weight. This is the flowers in the vase wilting before our very eyes. This is Wile E. Coyote plummeting to his death. The Weberian iron cage is not an attractive proposition, but I'm very, very grateful that it's not all doom and gloom. Peter has also left us with some rays of hope by which this can be escaped, keys to unlock the iron cage. And so please join with me in thanking Peter for a stimulating and insightful series of lectures.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us for our lecture tonight and indeed for this series. There's one last task which is mine, which is to present our lecturer with a small gift on behalf of New College. There is also a medal which is still being gilded and will arrive shortly, which we will forward to Peter in due course, but if I could invite Peter back on stage, I'll just present him with this small gift. Oh dear, now the ribbons come undone. How awkward. All right, there we go, sir. Thank you very, very much. Thank you for your working. Well, thank you again, everyone. For those who are here with us in the room, supper is served over the back here. Please feel welcome to stay. Please feel welcome to have a look at the bookstall, browse the bookstall. And for those online, thank you for joining us online, and we look forward to you joining us again for our New College lectures in 2026. Thank you. Good night.